to thank our Chief Bhante for this opportunity to return here again and to be able to share Dhamma. Also, I'd like to give my thanks to the other members of the Mahasangha, also brothers and sisters in Dhamma and Buddhist friends. I'm happy to see everyone here again today. Before we started the ceremony, Bhante asked me if I had a specific topic. I don't have anything planned. I'm just going to go with the flow. In my center, I'm asked to give Dhamma talks, but I like to refer to them as like Dhamma conversations. So, because I feel weird, like when it's just one-sided. I don't want to preach. I want to hear from the people, and I'm here to like try to address your concerns or questions and what you have. So I try to make it an interactive experience, so people don't doze off and fall asleep in the back like they usually do during these kind of events, especially in the traditional Asian style, right? The ceremonies are very long, and then everyone's nodding off in the back and the kids are running outside. So in order to try to avoid that, I try to make it more interactive. So I'm just going to go with the theme that's been kind of reoccurring in the last couple of weeks, that's been coming up, and that has to do with like the Buddhist perspective on morality or conduct, sila, discipline. So yesterday I taught the Dhamma school to the kids. So in most like Sri Lankan temples, on the weekends there's Dhamma school. And I went around asking them, why should we be moral, or why should we be good? And I went asking all the kids to see what their ideas were. Most of them were because something like, because Buddha said so, or my parents tell me, right? One kid's like, I don't want to go to jail, right? Very pragmatic morality. So other kids are like, I don't want bad karma. And then one kid said, it's because I want to go to heaven. So he's doing it for the rewards, right? So actually, from when I was growing up, I had this kind of idea also, like, I have to be good because the outside world is telling me to be good, right? And because of that, it was very difficult for me to be good because I didn't want to be good, right? Other people were telling me to be a certain way, and that way didn't go with the way I wanted to do things. So it was very difficult to be moral when it comes from the outside. And this is one teaching that we really have to understand. And sometimes it's misunderstood in the realm of Buddhism when we talk about Silabhata Paramasa. So usually it's translated as attachment to rites and rituals, right? That the Buddha said that there's no, we think that through rites and rituals, we have to abandon all rites and rituals, but I think everyone's noticed as soon as you came here today, we started off with some rites and rituals, right? So it's, what does it mean, Silabhata Paramasa? The principle here that's trying to be understood is that we have to refrain from thinking that purity can come from external means, right? So if I do a ceremony, a puja, I can purify myself through the ritual, or that some God is going to give me the purity, or the Buddha is going to give me the awakening. We have to kind of get rid of this extrinsic morality or heteronomous morality. My teacher, the late Bhante Punnaji, would always talk about autonomous morality or intrinsic morality. So the extrinsic heteronomous morality is like being good because your parents tell you, because you think Buddha tells you, because society tells you, because you're scared of bad karma, because you want to go to heaven. So you're just being good because of external conditions. If left to your own devices, if there was no punishment, if there was no reward, if your parents weren't looking, if you weren't scared of Buddha, what would you do then? Then you would just act the way you wanted to act, right? But what the Buddha was telling us to do instead is to look inside and through our own experience find moral truths. So this is something very radical. Instead of taking someone else's authority, the Buddha proposes that through our own experience, we can find the universal moral truths. We can find what is kusala and akusala, skillful and unskillful, or good and bad, to keep it simple. So there's one discourse called Dvaita Vitaka Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. And here the Buddha remembers when he was only a bodhisattva and he decided to run an experiment. He didn't want to take anyone else's authority on what was good and what was bad, or what was kusala or akusala. He sat in meditation and he said, okay, I'm going to meditate on greedy, angry, and violent thoughts, and let's see what happens. So he was meditating on these kind of thoughts, and he noticed that he didn't feel good. It wasn't going to give him good results. It wasn't good for other people. It wasn't good for anyone. He wasn't advancing in his meditation. So he said, recognizing that these kind of thoughts don't lead to the goal that I'm trying to achieve, I can say that these are akusala, or unskillful. They're bad thoughts because they bring harm to me, others, and both. Then he meditated on nekama, abhyapada, and abhihimsa, renunciation, letting go, non-hatred and non-violence, or metta and karuna, loving kindness and compassion. And when he meditated on these three kind of thoughts, he realized that it was good for him, good for others, good for both. That nothing bad can come out of thinking this way. So here, the Bodhisattva, through his own experimental knowledge or understanding, came to the truths, the moral truths, what is skillful and what is unskillful. Also, if we look throughout the suttas, when the Buddha talks about the practice of metta, he gives also a experiential understanding for the basis of the morality. He says, as am I, so are they. As they are, so am I. Taking this into consideration, one shouldn't kill other living beings. So here in this example, the Buddha is telling you that you're your own source of authority when it comes to morality. He's not saying, oh, some God or Buddha is telling you or anything else like that, or because of karma. Just look within your own experience. It's kind of like the golden rule, right? Treat others just the way you want to be treated. And in other discourses, the Buddha kind of gives the same example again. The Buddha says, all beings fear harm, all beings fear death. Knowing that all beings fear harm and death, taking this as one's own position also, one should not harm other living beings. So the appeal to be moral in Buddhism is always your own experience, your own suffering that you experienced in life. You reflect and you've seen and you reflect on the times when you've been harmed, when you've been cheated. And you think, well, I don't like it, other beings must not like it either, therefore I shouldn't do it to others. So this is really the basis of the Buddhist morality. Buddhist morality is experiential or experimental. Through your own experience, you figure out what is good and what is bad, instead of relying on others. And what's the benefit of this? What's the benefit of taking an experiential perspective on morality? Well, the reason it's so difficult for many of us to keep the precepts is because we don't want to. It's not what we want to do, right? But when you take an experiential understanding on morality, you don't have to worry about the precepts. Organically, naturally, you act in such a kind way because you're always taking others into consideration that you never bring harm to them. So instead of thinking, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that, and you have this long list of I shouldn't, you're thinking, I should be kind, I should do this, I should do that, because you want to help others, because you care about others. So if you're always concerned about others' welfare, you don't have to worry about keeping the precepts. Automatically, you'll be generous. That's why when we look at the Noble Eightfold Path, before the morality, before right speech, right action, and right livelihood, what do we have? Samma Sankappa, right? The right intention, or the right orientation. So if we first develop this wholesome way of thinking or this wholesome perspective on life, which is renunciation, loving kindness, and compassion, automatically the next 3 steps, which is sila, that speech, action, and behavior, follow. If you don't develop the right perspective, the right way of thinking, the right intention, to do the right speech, right action, and right livelihood is very difficult. It feels like a burden. You don't want to do it. Like when your parents tell you to do homework, or when you have to do chores. It's just something that you're doing because you think you have to do it. But when you have fully developed the Samma Sankappa, the second step on the Noble Eightfold Path, the next 3 steps automatically happen. That's why it's called, my teacher Bhante Puniji would call it autonomous morality. Autonomous means by yourself. You're no longer attached to rites and rituals or precepts or rules or laws. A person who's just good because someone's watching is not really a good person. A person who's just good because they fear being punished or is doing it for rewards is not intrinsically or autonomously or genuinely, sincerely a good person. They're doing it for other reasons. And if those conditions, external reasons were not there, that person would do whatever they wanted to do, and it may not be so moral. But if we change our perspective, if we change our way of thinking, then following the disciplinary part, the conduct, the moral behavior in Buddhism is easy, because that's what you want to do, because you care about others. That's really the way to approach the 5 precepts and everything in Buddhist morality, is reflecting on your own experience and acting in such a way that takes others into consideration, and yourself too. Because the kindness and compassion has to start with oneself. Because the Buddha says taking oneself as an example, or taking oneself into consideration. So that means if we don't understand the value of treating ourselves nicely, of having compassion and loving kindness to ourselves, then we can't extend it to others. Because we're the example, we have to take our own experience as the consideration. So it's very important that we start developing this loving kindness, this compassion towards ourselves. And this is one easy way to practice this, is through the development of the Brahma Viharas. So Brahma is like God or divine, and Vihara is dwelling, to dwell in the divine, or to have a divine mind, or a limitless mind also. The Buddha says the Brahma Viharas are described as that. And the first stage is the Metta, practice of Metta Bhavana. Bhavana means cultivation, typically translated as meditation. And Metta we translate as loving kindness, but it really comes from friendliness, Maitri. Like the Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of friendliness. So this kind of friendly attitude is this taking a perspective. Sometimes I think what's misunderstood when we talk about the Brahma Viharas or Metta, or compassion in Buddhism, or loving kindness in Buddhism, it has this kind of like sentimental dimension to it, which is not really the point of loving kindness or compassion in Buddhism. Actually, compassion, I have a whole argument against that word. Taking the passion of someone else, suffering with them, multiplying the suffering in the world, which is we're trying to alleviate and reduce it. I'll save that for another day. Metta is really understanding this, what the Buddha said. Understanding that other beings are like oneself. In the same way that I want to be well, happy, comfortable, and peaceful, other beings want to be well, happy, comfortable, and peaceful. In the same way that I don't want to be harmed, I don't want to be murdered, other beings don't want to be harmed and they don't want to be murdered. This is Metta, developing the state of mind of Metta. It's not to be sentimental. Sentimentality by itself is not going to get you anywhere. It's this changing of perspective, this paradigm shift in the way we see the world and ourselves and our role in the world. That's important. That's really the key into the Brahma Viharas. Recently, last week, I read an article and it talked about empathy, and there was 2 kinds of empathies these neuroscientists found out. There's the typical empathy that we think, which is called affective empathy, which is like, I'll give a very funny example. Your friend breaks up with their partner, and then they're sad and they want you to be sad with them, so you both cry together, right? Or they hate their ex, now you have to hate their ex with them too, and both of you are angry. That is the effective empathy, right? That's the compassion, which I don't like. You're being passionate with them. You're being dragged into their experience. But there's another dimension to empathy the neuroscientists found out, which is called cognitive empathy, which means understanding the other person, understanding their position, not getting wrapped up in the sentimentality, understanding their position, and then due to that understanding, you can try to help them alleviate the suffering and not suffer with them. Right? So when we talk about metta meditation, or developing a mind that wants to follow the precepts, a mind that wants to practice sila, good behavior in Buddhism, it really depends on this cognitive empathy, understanding other beings, taking the position of others, taking their perspective. That's really the key to this kind of practicing the Buddhist morality in this world. So I know here we like to keep the Dhamma Talk short, but I'll sacrifice some of my own time to hear from everyone here. If there's any comments or objections, or maybe I can make something a little bit more clear. Because I told you I like to have conversations and dialogues. I just don't want to preach, then we bow and everyone goes home. Because then I don't know if you understood. I want you to understand. Right? Just like cognitive empathy means you understand the other person. So I want to practice cognitive empathy right now. And I want to understand everyone here. Bante, is okay? Yes?
Would you expand on your description of sentimentality?
Mm-hmm. So sentimentality would be when instead of responding to someone else's suffering or whatever their affliction is, we react. Mm-hmm. So a reaction is unconscious and it's just driven by our previous habits, right? Kind of like the straw man example I gave of like when someone breaks up with their partner, then you going, right? It's a very straw man argument, but it's comical, so that's why I use it. So that's just the reaction, being sentimental. There's an emotion and you react with an emotion. But we want to respond. So this person's sad. Why are they sad? Try to understand them, right? And let them know that you understand them. And try to help them overcome and solve the problem. Instead of like getting on the bandwagon and yes, let's hate your ex. And I'll hate him with you. Or let's all be sad and let's go to Ben and Jerry's and drown our miseries, right? And ice cream. You're not solving the problem, right? You're just like, you're really like facilitating the problem then. So we have to kind of change that. Sentimentality, what I mean there is just a blind reaction that you're doing. And we have to respond instead, which requires the cognitive empathy. Mm.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So how do you explain it? Like if someone you care about feels sad or something like that, and you naturally like kind of mirror the way they feel, like say someone you both know dies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but sometimes you just reflexively mirror the same feeling because maybe you feel it too.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that work, like to avoid like tamping down your emotions or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
But not to be unproductive, but still not to be like a robot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah. So you're right. When we confront a situation, we're gonna fall back on our automatic response, which would be to mirror the emotion, right? That's just the way we are. When someone's sad, and if you care about them, you're gonna get sad too, right? So it's not to suppress it or deny it, right? But to be more mindful of it, and then consider the other person, right? Is me feeling this way at this moment the appropriate response to help this person? And it might not be. It might be for a little bit, right? Maybe you can cry with them for a couple of minutes and then, okay, now it's time to do the next step because crying is not going to solve the problem. So it's not a complete, in the beginning, it's not a complete rejection because we're not machines, we just can't turn it off. We're just gonna go back to how we are, but we have to reflect in those times that we do get sad and we do get angry and think, is this the best response for the situation? Is this gonna help solve the problem? Right? And then, obviously, throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout your life, you're gonna have to deal with those emotions and manage them, you know? And it might take years, like if it's a loss, it might take a long time to overcome it. But we should always reflect on everything that we do, our actions, our words, our emotions, our thoughts, and always look, is this the best response for this situation? And if it isn't, we have to try to overcome it. And sometimes the emotions cause more problems than they solve, right? And especially for our talking. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. You said something when you were talking about like autonomous morality. You mentioned something about we kind of get to see our place in the world, other people's place in the world, or role, something like that. It just made me realize, like, in Buddhism, like, what is our place or role in the world? Like in Catholicism, right? Like, we're in the world to establish some kind of relationship with God and go to heaven, right? In Buddhism, it seems like you just want to wait out and get out of samsara, you know, as quickly as possible, or do whatever you can to get out of here, right? But in the meantime, like, what is our role? Or what is the role supposed to be, you know, while we're here?
So, the primary, I would say, because I don't see any like direct, I can't recall any like direct statement by the Buddha where he says something like this. It might kind of be a problem in early Buddhism. It's kind of not well developed, according to my understanding. But if we look at the Four Noble Truths, I think it's very apparent. So our role in this life is to reduce suffering. Right? There is suffering, there is the cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, and the path leading to the cessation of suffering. So what we have to understand is that suffering is primarily a mental thing, right? Suffering is not pain. Pain can be a causing condition for suffering, but not necessarily. And sometimes we suffer more in our own minds than in any physical way. So it would be to relieve suffering, and we start with ourselves first. And to the extent that we can relieve our own suffering, then from the lessons we learn through relieving our own suffering, we can use that to help others, right? Like in my situation, this worked for me. You can try it out, right? And I think that's what we can call the purpose, which would lead eventually to the ultimate purpose of escaping samsara, because samsara, the way we see things right now, is suffering, right? So just alleviating suffering would be the role, but there isn't like no absolute meaning to it, right? And you'll find Buddhism very empty of absolute dichotomous thinking. So it's kind of like not fulfilling for us because we want meaning. We're always searching for meaning. We're storytellers. We like to tell stories, but at least from the early Buddhist perspective, which is the one I take, there isn't like this absolute declaration of what the meaning is, what your meaning in this world is. It's just to alleviate suffering for yourself and to help others on the way to the end of suffering. Yes.
Autonomous, what do we call it? Morality? Is that the word? Yeah. That sounds good, experiential, and I agree with that. But if you are if you are not wise, if you are young and you are experiencing things, there's opportunity to do a lot of harm, right? So I always thought that the 5 precepts are there kind of to bolster you in your ignorance, but you seem to not really talk about those as playing a role at maybe in an earlier stage or always throughout, but something that, you know, it's a narrower path, but it doesn't get you in trouble, you know, when you're doing it, even if it's extrinsic. Do you feel like there's an extrinsic role at any time, or?
I try to avoid like taking perspectives that rely on like control and power. So I try to appeal to people's sincerity or honesty or their Buddha nature, right? their original state, because we have to change our paradigm shift. We have to have a kind of change in perspective. The normal culture in the West has been that you're born sinful. And then because of the scientism or evolutionary theory, we're thinking that, all animals are selfish and they just want to procreate. And so we kind of have this kind of like, we're kind of have this malicious undertone to human existence, either on the spiritual side or on the materialistic side. We see humans ourselves as, there's something really wrong with us that's at our core. And in order to solve that, we need to control it somehow by the outside. But we don't get that kind of perspective in Buddhism. Actually, the Buddha says that the mind in its natural state is pure and luminous, free from defilements, but only becomes contaminated due to external influences. So it's this external thing, the extrinsic, the heteronomous aspect, which is the thing that caused all our suffering and is bringing in all the problems. This tendency to want to control or influence people. This is what I get from the Sabha Sutta, which I shared here last time. The Buddha says that all the contaminants, all the bad things are coming from the outside and the mind is naturally pure. So I'm working from this naturally pure state of mind and then appealing to that naturally pure state of mind. And that's why when I teach the kids about morality, instead of telling them, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, I always refer to their own experience and say, well, if someone were to steal from you, if someone were to hurt you, how would that make you feel? Oh, I don't like it. Okay, that's your basis for morality now, because you wouldn't like it when they do it to you. So yes, there's people who, due to causes and conditions and their karma, and that appeal might not be as enticing to them, right? They might not take to that experiential appeal. They might be very selfish, egocentric, and we might need to maybe present it in a different way, more like it's usually presented like in the karmic way. You'll get punished and you'll get rewarded, right? Or Buddha doesn't like it. So that might be necessary, but I see that as a last resort. We should always appeal to people's Buddha nature. We should appeal to their intrinsic luminosity and clear mind, instead of having our default mode be control. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you're going to get punished. Like, I think we need to change. That shouldn't be our first tool that we use. We should always appeal to people's better nature. That's my perspective.
Thank you.
Or have both. Or have both.
Mm-hmm.
A person can have an understanding that they actually do need some outside parameters and some outside structure, and see that as a part of, and it would be compassionate in that sense, that they would understand that, yes, I need this and I do appreciate these being there for me. You can have both. It doesn't have to be a one or the other. Thank you.
Oh yeah,
Does that
yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it can be integrated.
Yeah, it can be integrated.
It can be integrated.
Yeah.
The ideal state would be always like the intrinsic one, right? And that's the one that's the one we'll be aiming for when we're talking about liberation or awakening or enlightenment. It would be that you're no longer dependent on conditions. And that's the whole thing about the Buddhist teachings, the unconditioned. Nirvana is described as the unconditioned. It doesn't depend on external things. It's autonomous.
That's the healthiest.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk or the conversation. I have a question in regards to compassion, how you said that you don't. I can see how that can be problematic, having compassion. So you change it to
Cognitive empathy.
cognitive empathy. How would you do self-compassion?
Yeah. So it's weird how we kind of have this double standard, right? Like, we see ourselves different from others sometimes. Like, it's easier for us to forgive someone else's mistake, but when we make the mistake, we beat ourselves up over it, right? I should know better. I'm held to a higher standard, especially if you're Buddhist, right? Oh, I'm a Buddhist. I should be, more moral than everyone else. I should tolerate more than everyone else. So we have to let go of all that kind of chatter, blah, 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 and see that we're just like everyone else. And we're all sinking in the same ship. And however you would treat someone else in that situation, we have to treat ourselves. And obviously it's a process, and you work through it, and you find what works for you, because every person's different, and you have to kind of develop your own method to get there. But it starts with understanding that in the same way that you treat others, you have to treat yourself. If you have that problem. For most people, or for a lot of people, it's the other way around. They have to realize that they should treat others the way they want to be treated. But if you find yourself in the other way, you can just flip it around. And I'll treat myself the same way I would treat others. And that would work, but you have to kind of like do the work little by little to get there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, dear, based on the question, I had a question about for the country, suppose like a Buddhist country,
Mm-hmm.
and they get a war with the other country.
Mm-hmm.
So at the Buddhist country, the people always point the finger up, oh, you are Buddhist, you're not supposed
Mhm.
to fight, you're not supposed
Mhm.
to kill, you're not supposed to do whatever
Mhm.
the other side do. So
Mhm.
as the Buddhist country or the Buddhist practice,
Mhm.
what should we do to avoid that kind of criticize?
Well, here I'm going to have to take an unpopular position, a very extreme position, which I find in the suttas. So there was this monk who was going to go share the teachings of the Buddha in another country. And then the Buddha told him, you have to be careful. The people there are very rough. They might hurt you. Bhante, it's okay if they hurt me, as long as they didn't hit me with the weapon. Oh, what about if they hit you with the weapon? Oh, Bhante, it's okay as long as they don't stab me. What about if they stab you? Oh, Bhante, it's okay, at least they didn't kill me. What about if they kill you? Oh, Bhante, that's okay. So many people are looking for death, and me, without wanting to look for it, it came to me. Right? The Buddha said then after that, even if you were to be sawed in half, right, by a two-handed saw, if you think of a hateful thought in that moment, you're no longer my disciple. So the early Buddhist position is extreme pacifism. Right? So we shouldn't sacrifice our mind, our awakening for physical existence. So yeah, we do find ourselves in a very difficult situation. According to my understanding of the early Buddhist text, there's never any justification for violence or for some sort of like militant resistance in any way. So yeah, it kind of leaves us in a difficult situation where it leaves us at the mercies of people who like to use power and control. But we have to think, am I willing to sacrifice this life for awakening? What's more important, this life or awakening? And it doesn't always have to be that dualistic, you know? You might not find yourself in an extreme position, but we can find ourselves in such an extreme position where we have to think, what's more important, this life, this country, or my awakening? But there's never any justification from the early Buddhist perspective for any kind of physical resistance or fighting or violence.
Thank you, Bhante.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yes.
Thank you for the lecture, for
Mhm.
the Dharma. Meanwhile, I'm listening to you. My mind is wondering about the ancient monk Bodhidharma
Mm.
who came to China and started showing to the native Chinese monks
Mm.
certain movement as a way to defend themselves.
Mhm.
And they're gonna be killing. They're gonna start defending
Mhm.
themselves through the years based on that knowledge.
Mhm.
That you have to make your body strong as a way to get to nirvana as well, but also to defend.
Mhm.
So where we can locate that idea that
Mhm.
you are mentioned
Mhm.
regarding that philosophy that Bodhidharma came to China.
Mhm.
Defend yourself, make it strong your body, and otherwise they're gonna kill.
Yeah, well, I didn't know Bodhidharma, so right. But according to the suttas and the Vinaya, that kind of position is not accepted. Yeah. It's not accepted by the traditional Vinaya position and the traditional teachings that are found in the suttas. It's a later development, and I assume he had his own way of validating his actions, but all I can say is that it's not supported by the early Buddhist texts. Yes.
Question. What would you recommend is a good way for Buddhists to mourn when someone passes? So like I've been to 2 funerals these last 2 Saturdays, yesterday and last Saturday. You know, one was someone was very young, under 40, passed away, baby and wife, and the other person was older but still had 2 children. And it seems to me, in my my naive understanding of Buddhism, it's like we don't do good at consoling, right? Because what do you say? Well, we're all going to die, right? And it doesn't matter if you're younger or older. It's your expectation that you should be old when you die, but that's just an expectation, right? Or it's your expectation that you outlive your kids, but that's also just an expectation. But saying this to people, is just cold. It doesn't help, doesn't provide comfort. Or thinking it to myself, not particularly comforting, right? Maybe that's the expectation, that I should be comforted. Maybe that's the problem. But, right, like I feel like as a human being living in community with, and we lose people, and that's painful on some level. Like, what is the appropriate Buddhist response to mourning?
So the Buddha does give direct instructions about speech, and he says we have to know the time and place, and when the teachings are skillful and unskillful. So as soon as someone loses someone, you don't tell them, oh, everything's impermanent, suffering, no self, get over it, right? That's the time for a hug or something like that, right? But if you see it kind of becomes like detrimental, so where they can't function anymore, and it's hurting them, hurting their family, then you might try to share some Buddhist teachings, like, you can say, I've lost someone, and I'm managing to survive, and I'm still doing what other people have lost people too. You're not the only one. But you have to know the right place to give the teaching, right? And almost every other week I'm going to a funeral, so I have to do these kind of things all the time, and I don't start off with, get over it, everything's impermanent. I start off first by recognizing all the good things that the person who passed away did. So, maybe they didn't have many good things, only one, and I'll just keep talking about that one good thing that they did, right? So we can kind of work that way to get their mind free from this kind of like negative thinking. So when people pass away, we tend to think about like how we miss them, but we can also focus like on all the happiness that they brought us too, and reflect on all the good things that they did, all the help and how they helped us, instead of like thinking about how we miss them. So we can maybe change that that way of thinking that they have. Instead of saying like, oh, why me, why this, they're so young, you can think about, well, like, oh, they were young, but look at the rich life that they had, look at all the things that they did, and change the view a little bit until you can completely give it the whole pivot, the 180 later with the everything's impermanent. But we have to be gentle. Yes.
I just want to continue on that. When I was in here for a few years, and my mother had died, and I asked Reverend Shanti, how do I mourn? And he gave me a piece of advice I'd never forget. He said, for this 1 week, whenever somebody asks you for something, try to do it. If they ask you for money to eat, if they ask you for advice, do it without honoring your mother. And it gives you an action. And what I love about Buddhism is a practice of action. It's not a practice of beliefs. It's a practice of doing stuff. We have a practice that's beliefs. And I think that's the power of it. We all mourn, and we have to be appropriate. The idea is that everybody dies is like crazy, But I love that idea, and I think about that. That's a lovely thing to do, that you keep that person within you as you're doing actions that are
Actually, that teaching, Bhante, you gave is directly from the Buddha. The Buddha said when someone that you love passes away, you have to practice acts of generosity in order to show respect to your family members. Yeah, so that's what the Buddha's advice would be to people. When someone passed away, he would say, practice charity. For the next couple of days and weeks, you have to practice charity. And in those days, they would give away everything, actually. Like, people would give a good part of their inheritance away to the tribe and to the village after their... I think it says, you have to give gifts when your parents pass away, something like that. Right? So, just like a birthday party, right? But for everyone else gets the gifts instead of the person. So it's a nice idea that we have in Buddhism, a reverse birthday party. Something?